Hi, my name's Meredith, and last week, my little sister slapped me across the face in first class, in front of passengers, crew, cameras, while shouting I didn't belong here. What she didn't know? I own the airline. But this wasn't just about one slap. It was about decades of being silenced, dressed down, erased from my own family's legacy. This time, I didn't raise my voice. I raised the company. Before we begin, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below. Because this story, it starts quiet, but it doesn't stay that way. The last thing I expected that afternoon, as I quietly sipped green tea in my private first-class suite, was to be slapped across the face by my own sister. I hadn't flown commercial in years, but today I wanted to observe how my company, Sovereign Air, treated passengers without the CEO mask on. So, I booked a flight from San Francisco to New York under my maiden name, Meredith Ellis Allister. No escorts, no assistants, no boardroom buzz, just me, my leather tote, and a white handkerchief my grandmother had stitched for me decades ago. The initials still shimmered faintly, EEA. The moment Callista stepped into first class with that rehearsed smile she probably practiced in the mirror, I knew trouble wasn't far behind. She didn't see me right away, too focused on adjusting her name tag, fluffing her perfect curls. But once her gaze landed on me, her jaw tightened like a hinge that hadn't been oiled in years. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for every passenger in first class to turn. "You can't sit here." I stayed still, polite. "I believe I can." "Ma'am," she emphasized, her voice dripping with condescension, "this section is for our premium travelers, not staff sneaking up here for comfort." Whispers began to bubble behind the cushioned partitions. One man shifted uncomfortably. A woman clutched her pearls like this was some afternoon soap opera. I didn't rise, didn't even raise my voice. "I'm a paying customer." Callista snorted. "Yeah? And I'm the Queen of England." She turned to the other flight attendant. "Who let this woman up here? She's not supposed to be here." She looked back at me, and I swear I saw the same glint in her eyes that I'd seen in high school when she shoved me off the gym bleachers because I looked pathetic cheering alone. My cheek remembered the sting before her palm even landed, and then, crack. The slap rang out like a whip in a silent room. My head jerked slightly. My tea spilled. I didn't flinch. "You don't belong here," she hissed. "You never did." I didn't respond. Not out loud. But inside? Inside, I was 14 again, holding my cheek in the girls' locker room after she humiliated me in front of half the school for wearing our mother's old dress to the spring dance. People forget, but bodies remember. As I slowly reached down to retrieve my handkerchief that had fluttered to the floor, like my dignity, I noticed a little girl across the aisle watching. Her brows furrowed. She leaned toward the fabric. Her mother tried to stop her, but the girl picked it up and held it out to me with tiny, unsure hands. "Miss, this is yours." I smiled gently. "Thank you." The plane had gone still. The kind of stillness that follows something you know shouldn't have happened. I took the handkerchief back and gently folded it over the red mark blooming on my skin. I wouldn't give Callista the satisfaction of tears. Not here, not now. I looked up and caught the co-pilot, Daniel, standing by the cockpit door. His expression was unreadable, but I saw the flush of discomfort in his neck. We hadn't spoken in years. Once we were close. But after my promotion, he'd drifted toward Callista's orbit. Less risk, more reward. And just as I was about to turn away from him, the intercom crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your co-pilot, Daniel Reyes speaking. We'll be cruising at 38,000 feet, and we'd like to thank you for flying with us today. We are especially honored to have one of our own on board, Meredith Allister, our CEO." Callista went pale. Passengers stared, and I didn't move, because it wasn't the slap that stunned me. It was the pilot's voice crackling through the speakers, and what he called me. The cabin was still humming with disbelief. A few rows back, Someone coughed, and I heard the clink of a spoon against glass as a flight attendant nervously collected drinkware. But I didn't look up. Not right away. My fingertips were still pressed lightly to the place Callista had struck. It didn't burn anymore. But something deeper had ignited. The voice over the intercom was unmistakable. Daniel. His tone carried an edge of forced calm, like someone who'd just thrown a stone and was pretending to admire the ripple. Callista's eyes darted to me, then to the ceiling speaker, then back again. Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out, not a word, just that familiar look of panic she always wore when the mask cracked. A ripple of whispers flowed through first class. Passengers angled their heads toward me. One man muttered something about Sovereign Air's CEO and leaned to whisper it again to his wife. Her eyes widened as she stared. Callista turned on her heel and disappeared down the aisle without another word. She didn't even fake a smile. Moments later, Daniel appeared at the front of the cabin. "Captain Alistair," he said softly, deliberately. His voice didn't carry, but it was loud enough for the closest 3 passengers to hear. "Captain? Not miss, not ma'am, Captain Alistair." He gestured toward the lounge behind the cockpit. "Would you join me?" I nodded once and rose, gathering only the handkerchief and my phone. The little girl who had returned the cloth earlier gave me a shy smile as I passed. Her mother avoided my gaze. Daniel held the door open, then followed me into the small cabin behind the cockpit. It was quiet, dim, and blessedly private. I sat down, facing him. "So," I said, "that's how you say hello now?" He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't know how else to stop her. I figured calling you what you are might shift the room." "It shifted something," I replied. Callista's face nearly fell off. A pause. Then I added, "You didn't tell her, did you?" Daniel hesitated. "I assumed she knew. I mean, it was announced." "Internally," I corrected, "to senior management. And yet, somehow, my own sister, a face of the brand, didn't get the memo." He looked away. That told me everything. 6 months ago at the family brunch where my promotion was finalized, right after the board vote, I'd sat between our parents, barely able to touch my croissant. The moment was supposed to be triumphant, but my father had leaned in with a strained smile and whispered, "Don't go public yet. Let's ease Callista into the news. You know how she gets." I knew. She cried when I bought my first car because it wasn't hers. She went silent for a week when I got into Stanford and she didn't. Every win I earned felt like a strike against her. So I waited. I waited out of respect, out of loyalty, out of the false hope that my family could be proud of more than one daughter at a time. And in that silence, someone buried my name. Daniel leaned forward now, his voice quieter. "I tried to tell her once. She brushed it off, said the CEO was some guy named Everett." I blinked. "Everett? That's my middle name." She must have seen the EEA on the flight logbook and assumed, "She handles the logbook every flight." He didn't answer. He didn't have to. It was intentional. And for a brief, piercing moment, I couldn't breathe. The flight log. My name had been etched on the spine in gold, a tradition my father started. Every executive had their initials placed on the inside cover. For years now, Callista had been holding my name in her hands, turning the pages of my schedule, my authorizations, my directives, and she never once asked what the letters meant. Or maybe she did, and someone told her exactly what she needed to hear to keep me invisible. I stood up. Daniel rose too. "Meredith." "No," I said, firmly but without venom. "You don't get to soften this. You've been flying with her all year. You knew." "I didn't mean—" "You didn't want trouble. I get it. But that doesn't make you innocent." His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. I walked past him and opened the door to the cabin. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To find the logbook," I said without turning around. "I want to see how far this cover-up went." As I stepped back into the main cabin, a familiar voice crackled behind me. Callista's, through the crew's intercom. "We'll be landing in approximately 4 hours. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable." I could have laughed. Comfort? She'd just slapped the CEO of the airline mid-flight. I wondered how comfortable her job would be after landing, but that wasn't the real question haunting me. What I really wanted to know was who kept her in the dark, and more importantly, why? And that was when I remembered the scholarship, how she got it, and how I didn't. After the flight, I took the long way home from the airport. It was close to midnight when I finally stepped into my apartment. The city outside buzzed with weekend life, but in here it was still, almost reverent. I dropped my coat onto the bench near the door and kicked off my shoes with a sigh that came from somewhere older than my bones. I didn't bother turning on the lights. I walked by muscle memory, trailing my fingers along the edge of the hallway bookshelf. My hand stopped on a worn leather folder tucked between two flight manuals, one I hadn't touched in years. Dad's old filing sleeve. I didn't even know why I pulled it out. Some instinct, maybe, or the echo of that old feeling. Something was always missing, and maybe I'd find it if I just looked hard enough. Inside were a few yellowed pages of flight routes, memos, and one sealed manila envelope. My name wasn't on it, but the label read, AA Grant Fund, Original Application. I stared at it. My stomach tightened. I took it to the kitchen, peeled the flap open, and slowly slid the contents onto the table. The first page stopped my breath cold. It was my essay, typed neatly, signed at the bottom, Meredith Allister, age 17. I remembered writing it, that long Saturday in my room. I'd skipped prom planning with the others because I was determined to finish it on time. I wrote about flying with Dad, the way I used to sit beside him in the cockpit of the old trainer Cessna, how I felt safest above the clouds. I wrote about discipline, precision, passion. I poured myself into that piece. The second page was a transcript. Mine, GPA 4.3, SAT 1530. The third page, that one didn't belong to me. It was a signed approval memo from the selection committee, except the name printed at the top wasn't mine. It was Callista's. I leaned back and covered my mouth with both hands. No, this couldn't be. But then it all came rushing back, like a dam cracking in my chest. That college acceptance assembly, senior year. We all wore those itchy gowns in the auditorium. The scholarship announcements came last. The AA Aviation Grant, Principal Morrison said, beaming, awarded to a student with exceptional promise in aeronautics and public engagement. I already knew I'd won. Dad had practically guaranteed it. He'd hugged me that morning, told me he was proud, but they didn't call my name. They called hers. Callista stood up, smiling wide, soaking in the applause. Even then, something inside me fractured. I remember blinking in the crowd, stunned, looking toward my mom, who wouldn't meet my eyes. And when I got home later that afternoon, the framed certificate was already hanging in the hallway, Callista's name in gold letters, right where mine should have been. Back then, I told myself maybe I was mistaken. Maybe her essay was better. Maybe her interview went differently. Maybe I wasn't meant to win, but that envelope said otherwise. I flipped the last page over. A handwritten note was attached, taped lightly to the back. I recognized the handwriting instantly. The committee chair, Mrs. Eileen Brooks. We've decided on Callista. She photographs well and speaks with Polish, more suitable for media. Meredith's file will be held confidential. Her academic potential is clear, but she's more reserved. More reserved? I folded the letter in half, then again and again, until it was a tight square in my palm. They hadn't just overlooked me. They erased me. For the sake of appearances, I stood and walked down the hallway. My feet stopped in front of the picture wall just like they had 1,000 times before. Graduation portraits, our family ski trip, Mom and Dad's anniversary, 100 staged smiles. And there it was, dead center, the scholarship certificate, still framed, still glowing under the hallway light, still wrong. I reached up and touched the glass with my fingers. Cold. I thought about all the times I'd walked past it. The days I came home from college and tried not to look. The days I looked and tried not to care. They had told me it was for the family, for unity, for peace. But what they really meant was, for Callista. It always was. And I had swallowed it. Again and again. For years. Until my stomach grew calloused around the lies. But not tonight. I took the frame down, carefully, deliberately, and I leaned it against the wall face down, not smashed, just done. Back in the kitchen, I picked up the letter one last time and smoothed it flat on the table. Then I opened my laptop. I didn't type an email. I scheduled a meeting with the board. And I didn't invite my sister. Monday morning came too soon. I hadn't slept much. I didn't need to. My mind had done all the rehearsing while my body lay still. By the time I pulled up to Alistair Airlines headquarters, the sun was sharp over Dallas, slicing between the glass buildings like it was cutting something loose. I walked into the building with my badge clipped low, under the lapel of my blazer. No fanfare, no entourage, just me and the weight of what I knew now. The 10th floor conference room hadn't changed since Dad ran the place. Same long walnut table, same wall of frosted windows, same soft buzz of tension under the hum of the recessed lights. A dozen board members had already taken their seats, tapping screens, murmuring greetings. Felix sat 2 seats from the head. He looked up as I entered and gave the smallest nod. And then, there she was, Callista, flashing her camera-ready smile as if Friday's slap never happened, as if she hadn't humiliated her own sister on a plane full of strangers. She was dressed like a press conference, powder blue suit, pearls, not a hair out of place. I could almost hear our mother's voice behind it. When you're angry, look polished, make them guess. I took the seat directly across from her. Meredith, she said casually, like she'd just seen me in the kitchen and not, 3 days ago, struck me in public. Glad you could make it. We're all so proud of how far you've come. Her tone was dipped in something sweet, but it burned going down. The meeting began. Callista stood to present. Slides clicked onto the screen behind her. Charts, smiling stock photos. Vision 2030, the title read. As we all know, she began, Alistair Airlines is at a crossroads. The legacy that built us was beautiful, but we're entering a new era. Today's traveler wants more than reputation. They want resonance. She walked the room like a politician, perfectly modulated voice, her hand occasionally brushing the back of a chair for warmth. And while we honor family, she added, letting the word linger, we also recognize that heritage doesn't always equal leadership readiness. I stayed seated. I didn't blink. There it was, subtle enough to pass in transcript, sharp enough to draw blood. We're lucky, she continued, to have someone like Meredith involved, truly. But involvement isn't the same as innovation, and presence isn't performance. My fist stayed on my lap, unclenched. Felix across the table was already scribbling something. I glanced down as his hand slipped a folded note beneath the edge of the table. I took it in one clean motion. You're still on the original ownership clause. Call the next vote. My breath caught. That clause hadn't been mentioned in years. Dad had added it before retiring, quietly giving me the final say on major board decisions if leadership integrity was ever in question. Callista had forgotten it, or never knew. She went on for another 5 minutes, ending with a soft, we don't have to be led by the past, we just have to respect it. Applause followed, polite but uncertain. I stood slowly, not bothering with the clicker or slides. Thank you, Callista, I said. That was vivid. She smiled again. Just doing my part. I took a step forward. My voice was calm. I didn't raise it. I'd like to call a vote, I said. Murmurs rippled. A few board members shifted in their seats. Felix leaned forward. As per the original ownership clause, he said quietly but firmly, Meredith retains executive authority in the event of leadership dispute. Her father's signature is still binding. Callista turned. Her face drained a shade. What clause? She asked. I reached into my folder, slowly pulling out the document Felix had given me. The one you didn't know existed, I said. Because while you were rebranding us for Instagram, I was flying the night routes. While you were in front of the cameras, I was fixing what you broke behind the scenes. A beat of silence. Then I added, I think it's time we revisit the definition of leadership and who actually owns this airline. The silence after my last sentence wasn't silence at all. It had weight, like fog on a highway, thick with judgment and held breath. I left the boardroom with my head high and my jaw locked. Felix followed close behind but said nothing. He knew I needed a moment. I rode the elevator up to my office, each floor dinging like a heartbeat I refused to rush. When I opened the door, the room smelled faintly of lemongrass oil. My assistant must have lit the diffuser. I'd always found that detail grounding, a small kindness in a building full of people who'd rather see me seated than standing. I barely had time to unbutton my jacket before the door burst open. Callista. She didn't knock. She never knocked. She threw down a crisp sheet of paper with a bold headline, CEO battle at 30,000 feet, sisters clash in first class. I guess you're proud of yourself, she said, voice tighter than the smile she forced for every camera. You humiliated this company. You humiliated me. I didn't reach for the paper. I didn't need to. I knew how the media spun things. I didn't leak anything. No, she snapped, but you let it happen. And now this mess is everywhere. The press wants a statement, legal wants a direction, and I want you to act like a grown-up and fix it. My fingers grazed the edge of my desk, grounding myself in the smooth walnut finish. I have nothing to fix, I said. She laughed, sharp and dry. You're unbelievable. You think you can just waltz into the boardroom, wave around some dusty contract Dad signed 20 years ago, and poof, you're queen? I said nothing. Not yet. She reached into her tote and pulled out another sheet, this one folded once, neatly. A cover page glinted faintly from the reflection of my desk lamp. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. This is your resignation statement, she said. Public, humble. You'll say you're stepping aside for the good of the company, for unity, for family. I stared at the paper. She placed a pen beside it. It even sounds like you. I wrote it carefully. You wrote my surrender, I said quietly. She didn't blink. Step down, Meredith. Don't drag this through the mud. Just be smart for once. Sign it. The last word hung there, heavy. She waited. My hand moved, only to slide the statement gently aside. I didn't crumple it. I didn't toss it in the trash. I just let it sit there, a ghost of what she wanted to see. Get out of my office, I said. Her jaw twitched. Excuse me? You heard me, and next time, knock. She left, but not before muttering something under her breath. Something like, you'll regret this, though I couldn't be sure. When the door clicked shut behind her, I sat down. I allowed myself one breath, just one. Then I opened my drawer, reached beneath the organizer tray and pulled out the old key, the archive. Buried beneath the building's second sublevel was my father's offline document storage, where digital couldn't be corrupted and fingerprints still mattered. Most people thought it was shut down during the systems upgrade. They were wrong. I locked my office, grabbed my coat, and bypassed the elevator security with my old credentials. The sublevel smelled like concrete dust and old carpet, but it was quiet, reliable. I opened the metal cabinet labeled Succession. There it was, the original memo, typed, signed, sealed, to be enacted only in the event of misrepresentation or breach of fiduciary duty by any Allister heir. Primary leadership authority shall transfer to Meredith E. Allister. Dated. Initialed. I photographed it, then placed the original into a fireproof envelope and slid it into my bag. I didn't need to use it yet, but I would, when the moment came. Next, I called Elena Rivera, my father's old logistics director. She was the kind of woman who remembered every policy before it was digital, every handshake before it was hollow. Elena, I said, it's Meredith. There was a pause. Then, I've been waiting for this call. I smiled for the first time all day. Back upstairs, I moved fast. I copied key files from our internal server to a secure external archive, contracts, votes, travel records. The press hadn't touched these yet, but they would. I wanted to be ready when they did. By the time I finished, the office was dim. My lamp cast a gold circle over the unsigned statement Callista had left. I stared at it one last time before slipping it into a drawer, right next to a framed photo of Dad and me at my first flight lesson. No, I wouldn't sign. Not now. Not ever. A week later, I stood before the tall frosted glass doors of the boardroom, heels steady on the marble floor. Outside the windows, Dallas was sun-washed and cloudless, a contrast to the tension inside that room. Felix nodded at me as I entered. No words, just a subtle lift of the brow, like he already knew something was about to crack. Callista was already seated at the head of the table. She wore navy, our father's favorite power color. Her fingers tapped a rhythm against her coffee cup, nails immaculate, expression rehearsed. She didn't look up when I walked in. This meeting, officially titled a reconciliation session, had been requested by her. No, orchestrated. The timing, the attendees, even the fresh flowers on the credenza screamed of media optics. Someone was about to be sacrificed for the cameras. I just wasn't going to be the one. We began with the formalities, roll calls, statements. Callista smiled through every word, her tone syrupy. "We're gathered in the spirit of healing," she said, eyes never quite meeting mine. "But we can't rebuild trust without accountability." Then she pressed a button on her laptop, turning to the screen behind her. Audio played. My voice, or at least something twisted to sound like it. "Fire the legacy crew. Rename the brand to align with my vision. This airline is mine now." The room stiffened. I watched the HR executive glance at the legal counsel. The marketing director folded her arms and stared at the tabletop like it had secrets. Callista paused the playback. "This was submitted anonymously," she said, almost too sweetly. "But our team traced it to an internal voice memo, one recorded just a few days ago. I don't think this represents the leadership we want moving forward." Then she looked at me, her head tilted like she was confused. "Meredith, is there anything you want to say?" I stood. Calmly, no anger, just clarity. "Actually, yes," I replied. I turned to the board legal advisor and handed him my laptop. "Please open the file titled Server Log Authentication Chain.pdf. You'll find an access trail showing when that audio was pulled, edited, and re-uploaded to our internal server. The timestamp aligns perfectly with Callista's login credentials." Callista's smile faltered, just slightly. "And," I continued, "please play the original uncut footage, also time-stamped and logged. You'll find it under Flight 214 Full Cabin Cam Archive." The screen flickered. A video replaced the doctored audio. In it, I was standing in the aisle of a flight, calming a tense passenger situation. Firm, diplomatic, direct. "Our crew is here for your safety," I had said. "No one's being removed. Let's take a breath, sir." The footage ended with a few passengers applauding quietly and the cabin returning to calm. I let the silence settle. This time it belonged to me. Felix leaned forward. "Any board member who still believes the audio was legitimate, raise your hand." None moved. Callista shifted in her chair, her eyes darting toward the legal officer. "You're taking her word, based on logs she brought in herself?" "No," I said. "They were verified by third-party forensics. I anticipated your move." I reached into my blazer and clipped my employee badge onto my blouse, first time I'd worn it since that slap in first class. I felt it settle on my chest like armor. "I'm not here to play optics," I said. "I'm here to run a company, one that's been kept alive not by charisma, but by competence." The board remained quiet. Finally, the HR executive spoke. "Well, I think that answers our concerns for today." I nodded and gathered my folder. As I exited, Callista stood abruptly. "You think this is over?" I paused. "It's just beginning," I said without turning back. Callista blinked first, but this time I wouldn't. By the time the investor conference began the following Thursday, I'd already rewritten the rules of engagement. Gone were the days of absorbing the humiliation in silence. This time I was the one setting the tempo, even if Callista was still too arrogant to notice. The auditorium lights dimmed. Cameras clicked into position as a digital banner scrolled across the screen above us. Alistair Airlines, Vision Forward. Behind the curtain, a makeup assistant lightly patted my cheek with powder. I didn't need it, but the illusion of poise matters when your opponent mistakes quiet for weakness. I stepped into the light. The audience was a mix of internal board members, a few representatives from international investment groups, and external press streaming the Q&A online. Callista stood across from me, posture perfect, wearing a white blazer I knew she'd picked just to contrast with my dark navy. She believed she was framing the narrative. I was letting her think that. The moderator opened with softballs, market projections, sustainability efforts, overseas operations. I handled each with measured authority. Behind me, I could feel Felix's gaze steady as stone. I wasn't alone anymore. But then, halfway through my response on legacy program renewals, it happened. A woman in the back row, too sharply dressed for a typical reporter, raised her hand. "Ms. Allister," she began with just enough edge to sound polite, "before you talk about values, do you care to comment on the report released this morning about your offshore accounts in Dubai and the reported layoffs at Allister India?" The screen behind me flickered, and suddenly there it was, a blown-up exclusive from a tabloid affiliate, grainy screenshots of spreadsheets, a headline so sensational it could have come from a daytime talk show. "Sister CEO hides money abroad while cutting jobs." The room shifted. I didn't. I took one step toward the mic and held up my hand gently to quiet the whispers. "You might want to scroll to page 7 of that document," I said. The silence rippled. Behind me, I handed a printed packet to the moderator. "Page 7, I repeated, "contains a scanned clause from the founding charter of Allister Airlines." The camera zoomed in as the moderator flipped the pages, then paused. The screen behind me switched from the article to the clause I had anticipated they'd try to bury in footnotes. "In the event of misuse or sabotage by any executive, full decision rights revert to the original heir, as designated by the founding board." And beneath that, my father's signature, dated, verified, undeniable. The moderator looked stunned. Then from the left corner of the room, a chair creaked as an elderly man stood. He hadn't spoken a word since the session began. Most thought he was just a figurehead, one of the retired founders invited for optics. But James Allister's oldest business partner didn't show up for optics. He stepped forward, voice gravelly but firm. "This company was meant to protect those who serve, not reward those who sabotage," he said, eyes landing on Callista with something colder than disappointment. "She thinks loyalty is weakness," he added, "because she never had to earn it." Gasps, real ones, swept through the crowd. Callista opened her mouth, but nothing came out. I reached into my pocket and removed my father's vintage pilot pin. Silver, slightly tarnished but intact. I pinned it to my lapel slowly, deliberately. "This belonged to the man who built this airline," I said. "He gave it to me the day he told me I'd be the one to carry it forward, not in public, not for applause, but in private because that's what trust looks like." Felix stepped beside me, nodding to the control booth. The moderator ended the segment, but I wasn't done. I turned to Callista. "You taught me silence," I said calmly, so only the front rows could hear. But I turned it into strategy, and strategy doesn't scream. There are moments when silence doesn't feel like surrender, it feels like thunder waiting to roll. That morning, the sky over Dallas was dull gray. No rain, just a quiet hush over the tarmac, like the air knew something was coming. I wore my navy suit, the same one from the investor conference, only this time I paired it with a silk scarf. Pale blue, the exact one Callista once scoffed at during our first joint flight training years ago. "You look like you borrowed that from a lost and found," she'd said then. Today it was knotted perfectly at my throat. Today I wasn't hiding anymore. The executive terminal had been converted into a formal hearing space. The company had invited representatives from the crew union, HR, legal, and executive leadership. The hearing was to be streamed to our global staff. Callista's idea. Her way of salvaging public perception, or what remained of it. The moment I entered the room, heads turned. Cameras were already rolling silently. Callista stood near the front, flanked by her legal consultant and one of the PR officers, who looked more nervous than she did. She wore that frozen smile, the one she reserved for moments where she thought she had a win in her back pocket. She barely looked at me, just whispered something to the union rep, who nodded stiffly and made a note on his tablet. The hearing began with formalities. HR read the statement of purpose, then a brief reminder that this session had been called due to behavioral concerns involving executive personnel and the need for full transparency within the Alistair Airlines leadership structure. I stayed quiet, even when my name was mentioned, even when Felix glanced at me with that subtle tilt of his chin that used to mean your move. I waited. Then the moderator asked if either party had an opening statement. Callista stepped forward, feigning humility so badly I could hear my late father's sigh in my head. "I love this company," she began, "and I know we've all made mistakes. But I believe the people watching today deserve accountability, honesty, compassion from their leadership." She turned to face me, "which is why I think it's important we all see what really happened on that flight." With a tap on her remote, the screen behind her flickered and played the now infamous footage. The public version, the one where I appear silent, still, and, most notably, faceless as she leans over and strikes me across the face. It was enough to stir a reaction, sure, but not outrage. Not yet. She looked toward the panel. "This is not just about behavior, it's about perception and leadership." That's when the union rep turned to me. "Ms. Alistair, do you have anything you'd like to present?" I stood slowly. Not rushed, no theatrics. I reached into the leather folio Felix had slid to me before we entered. "No statement," I said, then pressed play on my own tablet. A different screen lit up, a new angle, the internal cabin feed, unreleased to the public. Same event, different truth. This one showed Callista's full face, her curled lip, her mocking tone as she leaned in, the audio now crisp, clear. "You don't belong in first class. Crawl back to economy where you came from." The slap followed. It wasn't anger that stirred in the room, it was collective disgust. Even the legal officer looked away. No one spoke as the video ended. No one needed to. I took a step forward. "My first act," I said, voice even, "as returning CEO, is to implement a zero-tolerance policy for abuse, toward staff, toward passengers, and toward each other, effective immediately." I handed the signed executive order to the HR director. She reviewed it, then turned to Callista with quiet precision. "You're being placed on indefinite leave pending formal dismissal. Please remove your badge." Callista's eyes finally cracked. She glanced toward the cameras, toward me. But I said nothing. She hesitated, but only for a moment, then unclipped her badge, placing it on the table without ceremony. No defense, no tears, just emptiness. As she walked past me, her heels didn't click as sharply as usual. I turned to the room and, more importantly, to the staff watching all over the world. "For years," I said quietly, "I cleaned up her messes behind the scenes. Today, I cleaned her name off this company." There was no applause. There didn't need to be. I adjusted the scarf around my neck, the same one she once called pitiful. Funny how power shifts. The slap was heard by millions. But what came after? They didn't see coming. Not the quiet reorganization. Not the morning I sat at my desk and signed off on Callista's formal termination. Not the letters that went out to the staff she'd humiliated, those who'd been skipped over, silenced, or simply ignored under her reign. And certainly not the small silver key I carried to a first-class cabin before the sun rose over Phoenix. 1 week later, the annual Alistair Leadership Summit filled the hotel ballroom with executives, training staff, union leaders, and fresh hires. I'd opened with a short, steady speech. No theatrics, no dramatic reveals, just vision, and a vow to never let silence be the cost of harmony again. After the applause died down and the cameras dimmed, I walked through the long glass corridor toward our training lounge. A new hire orientation had just wrapped, and they were mingling over boxed lunches and brand new badges. A young woman, maybe 24, maybe 25, walked up to me cautiously. Auburn braid over one shoulder, eyes like she had read every single news article twice. "Hi," she said, lowering her voice. "I heard about what you did." I smiled. Which part? She blushed, laughed nervously. The flight, the slap. Was it hard? Like standing there, taking it. I looked at her for a long moment, then leaned in slightly and replied, harder to stay silent. She nodded, like she understood more than she was saying. Before I could turn away, someone else approached me. An older man, maybe in his 70s, neatly dressed with a slight limp. He extended his hand. You probably don't remember me, he began. I sat in 4C that day. And just like that, I did. The beige cardigan, the crossword, the gentle way he'd looked at me with quiet concern after the incident. I just want you to know, he continued, voice firm but kind, I saw the whole thing. I've flown this airline 30 years, and I'm glad you didn't stay quiet. I shook his hand. I remember you asked if I was okay. You didn't answer. I guess I didn't have the words yet. We smiled. Then he tipped his head and walked away. Just one voice, but it stayed with me longer than the roar of any crowd. Later that afternoon, I stepped into one of our parked aircraft on the runway. No passengers, no crew. Just me and the silence of a cabin preparing for tomorrow's flight. First class was pristine. Sunlight cut across the leather seats in diagonal ribbons. I walked to Suite 1A, sat down, closed my eyes. Then I reached into my bag, the scarf, pale blue, the one I'd worn the day everything changed. I folded it slowly, edges sharp, tucked it into the zippered pouch of my briefcase, not out of shame, but because I no longer needed it to remind me of what I survived. I was no longer proving myself. I was leading. A soft knock at the cockpit door startled me. It was Felix. Your PA said you'd be out here. I nodded. Needed a few minutes before dinner. He handed me a paper coffee cup, sat across from me, careful not to make it feel like anything more than two colleagues talking life over caffeine and closure. So what now? He asked. I sipped, looked out the window where a new crew was walking toward another aircraft. Now, I said, I hire people who don't ask where you belong, just how far you want to go. Felix leaned back. You sound like your father. I shook my head gently. No, I sound like someone who finally stopped whispering his lessons to herself and started living them. Outside, the last of the crew boarded. My scarf stayed tucked away. So did the weight I'd carried for years, because sometimes dignity doesn't need a microphone, just a one-way ticket. Forward.